I'm a little bit of maybe a pessimist in this front. And that comes from a belief that I have that the financial industry is not aligned with general financial literacy. So what that means in particular is that the financial industry gets money from overdraft fees, from trade transaction fees, from when the meme stock issue was going on, Robinhood was making money off of the volume of trades and the information of those trades. Like, that is how they make money. So the more volatility, the better for the financial industry, because all of those transactions, whether they're credit card transactions when people are buying stuff, or whether they're trade transactions when people buying shares of a company, that's where they're making money. So the idea that financial institutions are going to help try to promote more responsibility on that front, less engagement with the financial, less engagement with the sort of casino of the financial industry, to me is not particularly plausible. They have too much to lose and they have too much to gain from keeping things the way they are, or even exacerbating them.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies podcast. This is our 50th episode. It's really hard to believe that we're already at 50. I think we started this back in February of 2021, so a year and a few months in at 50 episodes already. Really appreciate all the support we've seen from everybody. Before we do get into the details of today's episode, please be sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications. Also, if you are a climate tech founder with specific questions you'd like us to ask on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me. Or if you're looking to connect with other strategic partners, or perhaps looking to get connections with capital, you can also reach out. I'm glad to, again, help wherever I can. So reach out on Slack or LinkedIn is the best. And then let's get into today's episode. So today's episode, as mentioned previously, is with James Regulinski, who is the co-founder of Carbon Collective. Carbon Collective is a financial services firm that helps people ensure that they are achieving their financial goals, whether that be short-term savings or retirement, in a way that is climate aligned. So with Carbon Collective, you will know that your money is going into places and going into companies that are kind of aligned with, I shouldn't say kind of, that are aligned with the climate goals, and rather than being part of the problem. So really interesting platform that they've built. Is pretty surprised to understand that they are the first of their kind to do this. I would have assumed there had been something else already, but very interesting that they're doing this. In our discussion, we covered a lot of different things, from what they're doing at Carbon Collective to the reasons why to invest in climate-aligned funds. We discussed financial literacy, which is something we've not had on here before, or not discussed before. Responsible investing, education system, how to get into finance. We did also touch a little bit on the blockchain technology, and whether or not it does align with climate goals in general. So we had a bit of a kind of a debate back and forth between us. That was really fun. But overall, really great conversation with James, and it's really great to see what they're doing. As I mentioned before, quite surprised that this is not something that has been kind of promoted already or built. So really excited to see what they're doing, and I'm sure it'll continue to become very widely adopted as a method to help kind of drive demand towards a greener future. So before we get into the show, also again want to make mention to our sponsors, Next Wave Partners. Next Wave Partners are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, technology, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing, maybe you have specific needs, technical or commercial, whatever they may be, any specific needs, you can reach out to them to help grow your team. They really take a holistic partnership type of approach to their searches and to working with their clients. And of course, if you are an individual looking to make a career change, you can also feel free to reach out to one of their consultants. You can do that via their website at next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. But without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the pod, James. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's glad to be here.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to have you on. I guess let's start where we always start, and just kind of give us an introduction to yourself and what you're doing now.
Okay, I'm James Regulinski. I am currently one of the co-founders at Carbon Collective Investing. And my background isn't actually in the financial world, it is in engineering. So I come to this space with a bit of an engineering mindset.
Okay, and could you talk to us a little bit about how you ended up coming into the space? Like what really was the impetus to go from engineering? Could you specify what type of engineering into finance?
I was working on mechanical engineering for various different companies that were working on different climate change solutions, generally in the energy space. But my idea was, I have this technical background. I'm going to use it to build things because we need things to save the planet. We need things to keep global warming below 1.5. We need things to solve our various woes. And one of the really transformative books I read at some point, maybe in 2017, 18-ish, was Project Drawdown. And what Project Drawdown showed me was that we have all the technologies we need to hit the goals we want as a society, to keep our planet in a healthier place, to keep our environment in a healthier place. And it wasn't that we needed more engineers building more things per se. It was that we didn't have collective focus. We didn't have the ability to bring all these people together and say, yes, we are going to build these particular sets of tools that are going to help us alleviate this problem. That's a coordination, that's a collective action problem. And engineering isn't necessarily, at least the tools that I had learned, weren't necessarily the right tools to make that much more social problem change. So at that point was when we were wrapping, Zach and I, he's my co-founder, we're wrapping up what we were working on at the time, and we're thinking about what we're going to be working on next. And we knew it wanted to be around climate change. And so we were asking these hard questions, which are, what are the problems that actually need to be solved, and what are the skills you need to solve them? So we stumbled into the financial space as a realization that it is one of maybe 3 different really powerful technologies we have around coordinating large groups of people to get a common vision done. And it was the one that was probably most functional in the United States, which is where we're both located, for better or for worse.
That's quite interesting. Could you talk about, I guess I'd be really keen, maybe talk about Zach's background as well. How did you guys actually make that leap from engineering into finance? Because it's kind of, it seems like a scary thing sometimes, right? Could you maybe talk a little bit about that process and how you convince people to get behind and to back what you're doing?
Yeah, Zach had much more of a business background than I did. And he had run the business side of our previous company, Osmo Systems. But what it came down to was we did a bunch of research. We talked to experts in the field, and this was part of our discovery process. When we start a new company, it's really easy to say, oh, I want to build this particular thing, and then build something that no one wants. So we believed it was important to start with a discovery process where we talked to a lot of people, both on the side of individuals who might use whatever we built, and in experts who were trying to solve various problems around energy, clean energy production, distribution, transportation, all of the questions around this transition away from fossil fuels. And through that process of just talking with people, interviewing them, looking at what else had been built, that was when we made the realization that we needed to change the way that we were investing. We personally felt that pain in terms of not having a good place to invest our own money that we felt comfortable with. So it was something that we were studying and trying to understand what was best practices. And it kept coming up that people assumed that if you invest your money in a way that is more aligned with your values and creating the kind of world you want to live in, that you would be taking a financial hit. And so we dug into that question and just asked the question, why? There's a game in discovery when you're interviewing people, which is to ask 5 whys. And similarly to this whole space of how do we invest responsibly? Why is it more expensive? Why is it worse returns, et cetera? We kept asking those questions. And when we came down to the core of what we actually believed, the kind of world we wanted to build, we found that we could build the portfolio that we wanted to. But we didn't see anyone else doing that. We saw a lot of greenwashing. We saw a lot of people making claims that were obscure and hard to understand. And this portfolio that met our requirements didn't exist. And when we started talking to other people who had decades of experience in the space, they were excited by it. They were like, wow, this actually works. And so there was a bit of an outsider's perspective that was necessary to look at what was currently going on in the investing world and ask the question, could we do better? And wearing my engineering hat, you run the numbers, and if they come out better, they come out better. Like if you can do this with low fees, if you can have a lower carbon associated with your portfolio, if you can be enabling technologies that we need to be building to transition our economy away, then you do. And those are you can look at what, in our case, we publish everything we do online. You can look at what it is, and you can delve in and try to figure out what other people are doing. And if you look at that, you can come to the same conclusion we can, or you can say that we're wrong. But in either of those cases, it's very open. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think this is generally quite interesting. Especially, I'm super fascinated by the fact that you had a chemical engineering background of all things,
mechanical
engineering background of all things, and still that's pretty impressive. and then starting this finance company. So let's talk more about what exactly Carbon Collective is doing. Could you kind of just go into the details and the nitty gritty of what exactly is it?
Yeah, so we're a registered investment advisor, which from the SEC's perspective means that we give financial advice. We're an internet-only financial advisor, which is the category that they've designated for robo-advisors. So we do all of our trades algorithmically. That means that we set up these portfolios, and we don't go in and say, oh, we think that Apple's going to do really well, so we're going to buy some Apple for you. We actually build portfolios that say, we're mostly going to track the market, and we're going to cut out the worst offenders, the industries that will not survive in this transition, that are not taking those steps necessary, the highest carbon emitters. And we're going to replace them with the companies that are actively building the technologies that we know we need to be investing more into. There's about a $5 trillion gap right now in investment to hit the project drawdown goals of pretty much across the board, right? That's the pile of money. Now, that's a lot of money, and the mind boggles when you think about numbers that big, if mostly what you deal with is your own personal banking, but it's all money that's there. Like, we have collectively as a society, we could be investing that amount into these solutions. So we're hoping to lower that gap. So we cut out for our base portfolio, our core portfolio, we cut out the worst actors. These are energy companies, traditional utilities, industrial materials. We cut out those sectors. And then we replace them, as I said, with the companies building drawdown solutions. We're also working towards putting additional pressure on companies through proxy voting and shareholder resolutions. Now, we're only in the nascent space of doing that, but it's something we're working towards. And we think it's all part of this ecosystem of changing the way that this money that is your money can also be your voice, can also be pushing towards a vision of the future that you want to live in. And that, for us, that vision is one in which we've transitioned away from oil, and we've transitioned to a point where we can be pulling more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we're releasing every year. And that's not only a positive vision in terms of, I don't want to live on a planet where I'm dealing with the kinds of forest fires and natural disasters that we're seeing more and more of, but also positive in terms of when you start making those transitions, when you move from gasoline-powered cars to electric cars, the air you breathe on a day-to-day basis is better. When you deeply electrify your home, the air you breathe inside is better. There's these downstream effects of this vision that is just a healthier way to live, which for me is exciting. So it's not just that there's three ways in which this is better. So like you have on the financial side, our portfolios mostly track the market. Now, we can't promise any future. I'm not anyone's here's financial advisor. I can't promise any returns, and I won't promise any returns, but we mostly track the market, or try to track the market, which means that, you know, as the market goes up, these portfolios mostly go up as well. And if you believe that when we make this transition, we will make the companies in our climate solutions fund will do even better, then there could be some potential upside there. So that's like, your investments aren't doing worse. We're not charging more fees. We charge the same as most robo-advisors, so like 0.25%. And so that's the investments are as good as the traditional option. And then the world we're building, the technologies are better than what we currently have too. So you have these assumptions that folks carry from a long history, long campaigns against sort of the environmental movement or this transition away from fossil fuel, from entrenched companies, that says that this is going to be worse for you, worse for your pocketbook, destroy the economy. And really what we're seeing is where we start to take these actions, it's better for your pocketbook, it's better for the local economy, and you have this positive outcome that's just really where folks want to be. So we've now, what we believe is built a portfolio that is ethically aligned with what people want and does well for them financially, And that is at the heart of what folks wanted when they were looking for sustainable investing.
Yeah. Are there any side effects that you might talk about from a geopolitical, like governmental standpoint, right? If a country is early to invest in these technologies and kind of adopt them and maybe perfect them, are there, it may be hard to find clear examples of winners already because it's kind of an early stage, but are there some other benefits to governments as a whole as well?
We're going to quickly get outside of like my expertise, but I'll give my best shot at answering this. And I think the inverse of that is pretty obvious right now with current events. With not trying to belabor this point very much, but a lot of Europe's response to the war in Ukraine has been hamstrung by their dependence on oil imports from Russia. Mm-hmm. A lot more complexity there that I'm not, as I said, going to be able to get fully into. But when folks talked about energy independence in the US, and the folks in the US who talked about it often were talking about drilling more oil and gas for us, they saw very clearly that there are political implications of having something so tied into our day-to-day survival and economy and well-being be in the controls of other actors. Now, on top of that, when you talk about things like renewables, which are also a distributed energy generation technology, you start to have these, the positives can be mixed. There is the ability to have grid resilience, which when you have deeply centralized power plants, this is less the case. So if you have more backup power storage like batteries, it makes the localized grids more resilient towards things like natural disasters or towards other energy price fluctuations or even actual energy fluctuations that would take down the grid otherwise. So while you could build a grid that is less stable with renewables, you can also build a grid that is more stable because solving that problem becomes integral to switching over. So those are some of the ways in which on a larger scale, like not being dependent on others, whether that's sort of state by state or country by country, can give you more flexibility in what you choose to do in your international or sort of domestic policy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm also very keen to understand how it will play out with, for example, the especially food production, right? With a lot of vertical growing, it's super efficient comparatively to traditional farming. Like a lot of countries may not have the resources to produce on, through industrial farming methods, the amount of food they need, right? We see the issues that are probably going to come in Africa, unfortunately, over the next few months here with the planting issues, right? Because of the war. Sure. That's one area I find interesting. I think you're right. It's probably a little bit out of the depth of both of our experience, but it's worth touching on.
I think what is the heart of this is like large global scale centralization versus more distributed forms of production. And both of what the examples that we gave were like, when you take an example, a more distributed, more localized situation or solution, then you actually can have more resilience in the face of global disruption. And when from the sort of the left, the eco side, if you look at that, you're saying, oh, well, sort of polycultures are better than monocultures. You hear that language. Ecosystems are more diverse or more resilient. Or if you look at it from maybe a more conservative perspective, like you don't want big government telling you what to do. They don't know what is best for your local situation. In both of those cases, there's like a respect for the local conditions. And in doing so, you can have the ability to sort of meet the needs of that geographic location better than the cheaper prices that come from a more global regime that are often underpinned, subsidized in the case of like oil and transportation and so forth, that make them seem cheaper, but then there are these add-on costs that only show up later.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I was actually going to bring that up because I think that there's a lot of people who kind of feel that climate change is maybe it's a left issue and all these things, but it's like there's so many other benefits to it that people need to start to realize and kind of open their minds. It's first of all, the planet. Obviously, we need to preserve the planet. But even if you go beyond that, right? If you don't believe that's going to be the worst case scenario, there's so many other benefits geopolitically and otherwise. So I appreciate you bringing that up. One thing I wanted to go back on, if you could talk a little bit about, is proxy voting. Could you explain what proxy voting is and how you mentioned that this can play a role in helping to shift kind of what companies are doing?
Yeah, so just real fast primer on proxy voting. A publicly traded company for certain issues have to take into their voters, their shareholders' opinion. And there's also in that mechanism, there's the option for shareholders to bring up resolutions that might not have been brought up to the company otherwise. So it's a somewhat democratic process, ignoring for a second that it isn't one person, one vote, it's one share. And so someone who owns more of the company will have a bigger voice. So it's not fully democratic, but it is a way that if you do own shares in a company, you can express your opinion, either on something that they're trying to do or bring up something that you think they should be trying to do. In the second case, it's more expensive, more time consuming because you actually have to bring the resolution to one of these board meetings. However, on the former case, you can absolutely express your displeasure and say the compensation structure that a company is trying to promote, because they will have to vote on that fairly regularly, on that's how much bonuses their C-suite gets in particular. Now, even on the second case, you might not personally be able to put a resolution on the table, so to speak, but other people are. And so if you care about, say, how they're reporting on their various different emissions, or tying different incentives to different environmental outcomes, and someone has put that resolution forward, you do get to vote on it. So that's a way that you can sort of express your opinion. Now, that's like stage one of like, just what is proxy voting? How do you use it? The second part that's interesting is as folks get more coordinated about saying, this is what we care about, you start to get companies that will listen before a resolution is even brought to the table. So groups like As You Sow, which has been on the forefront of using proxy votes, they'll come up with a resolution and be like, hey, Microsoft, this is the resolution we're going to try to put forward. And Microsoft will go, hey, let's talk about it. Let's get ahead of this. Instead of bringing this up, let's just voluntarily create this plan. So you start to have, as you have more success in these proxy vote battles, if you will, or proxy vote sort of changing a company, you can even build up some reputation and then use that to help the conversation move forward before you have to go through the more expensive process of the vote, of bringing it to the ballot. Now, so those are like the best case scenarios. We skip having to bring it to all the shareholders to some extent. We start being able to push these issues forward. What also has happened is that proxy voting is somewhat non-enforceable. It is a way of expressing your opinion, but it's very hard to hold companies to this. And so I think that's one of the big shortcomings. Now, that said, I think why companies respond so strongly to certain proxy vote issues has often been that they have some public facing, their reputation is important. If Coke gets asked to do something and a whole bunch of people are on the proxy side are pushing them for it, and then they don't live up to it, there's the ability for customers to then view Coke less favorably. So there's some amount of willingness to go forward with shareholder resolutions simply because they don't want the reputation. So we've seen in various different situations, we've seen the whole gamut. We've seen it, come up as a very confrontational thing to very cooperative thing. We've seen it come up as they follow through, and we've seen them not. And then one of the most famous examples recently, if people have been following the space, is what Engine No. 1 did, which was actually get different board members onto ExxonMobil. So that was another way that you can use proxy voting to sort of change what's going on and say, we want different people in the room. We want a different board representing us. And so that's a fairly strong, we don't know how it will play out in terms of their ability to change what ExxonMobil is doing or their core business or how they relate to climate change, but it was a very powerful statement as far as our sort of the shifting perspective that that shareholders have on what is the responsible way to act as a company.
Mm-hmm. So in general, though, through the fund that you guys have created, the funds you have, is this going to help kind of push along a lot of those changes and put the pressure?
I mean, that's our hope. I don't want to be hubristic here, and we are right now still a very small fund. And even in these cases, it's often through coalition building that they've gotten enough votes to make a difference on these ballot initiatives. So we believe it's an important part, and that any firm that's working seriously in this space should have a plan around and consider. And as we grow, and we believe the space needs to grow, and that likely means that we will have an opportunity to become a lot bigger. As we grow, the number of assets we have, the number of shares we have, we can become a more and more powerful voice in that space.
Okay, very interesting. Why don't we talk about a little bit, who are your clients? Who should be coming to you? If people are listening, who should reach out to get in touch?
Most of our clients right now are just individuals. These are folks with IRAs, folks with old 401ks they're rolling over, folks who have a little bit of money that they want to put into the stock market, but aren't into stock picking. Our portfolios are diverse. They're broadly invested. They're low fee, relatively speaking. Like, these are things that tend to perform better over time. And so that's sort of a very bogglehead mentality that I threw out there. It was just like, we're not going to try to be stock pickers and beat the market. We're going to try to invest with the market. We're going to do it as low fee as we can. And we're going to keep you sort of broadly diversified, like your investments broadly diversified, so you're not getting a large exposure to like particular sectors or fluctuations. Now, that said, since you're divested from oil, we're not capturing the gains that oil saw recently because of the scare or because of what's been going on in Europe. However, we believe that is a short-term kind of thing. So lots of individuals invest with us. We just launched a 401k program, which means that companies that want to have a 401k for their employees can now sign up with us, and we would build these portfolios for their clients. So we're starting to be able to offer more options for folks.
I mean, I think that's pretty powerful, to be honest. Companies who want to have climate-aligned types of funds, because like you said, if there's really no others really doing this, I mean, maybe there are some that have to some extent like themes, but I feel having a very clear, hey, this needs to be climate aligned, would be interesting, especially for lots of the renewables companies, for example, right, who are probably have a 401k and probably not investing in the enemy's camp, perhaps. I think I'd be keen to understand, I guess, just your broad thoughts on kind of the future of the financial industry in this way. Maybe kind of whatever you see is coming down the line, because you're in the space right now. What are some of the trends that are happening, and kind of maybe perhaps your hopes for over the next 5 to 10 years, what we'll see?
Yeah, maybe I want to start out with like where we came from, a little bit of some history about some of the terms people hear, because we often get lumped into what's called ESG investing. And ESG investing it's been a buzzword for a while now. And when people hear it, I think what they hear is socially responsible investing. They hear, what I want is to be invested along with some set of values, whatever those values are. In the ESG case, they literally stand for environment, social, and governance, which is ostensibly, how does it relate to the environment? How does it relate to social issues? And how does it relate to governance issues? However, while there's been a massive influx of dollars into the ESG space, what most people don't realize is that what ESG actually is a hedge against risks associated with that, which is a very financially way of looking at the world. It does not mean, and MSI, which is the largest provider of ESG data, says this on their website, the ESG score is not a representation of a company's goodness. So if people look at ESG and think, I'm investing in a good company, they may or may not be. And you see this all the time in funds that say they're ESG, they have oil in them, or they have companies that are profiting off of environmental destruction in a very core way. And that leads to both confusion and frustration. So as more scrutiny comes down on what it means to be a climate-focused or environmental-focused company, ESG has been starting to feel the strain. From the consumer side, there's more criticism of it. And from the regulation side, from the SEC, there's more regulation of it. So we're seeing it come from both sides. And I think that's incredibly valuable because of this lack of transparency of what it is, and this big mismatch between what people think it is and what it actually is. And I bring all that up to say, because where I think the investment space is going to be into deeper, stronger themes. and a more fragmented, more split along ideological lines. We saw this happen somewhat in BlackRock. BlackRock is one of the earliest and largest ESG providers. And when Texas was a teachers union, there was, I'm now, it's embarrassing, I can't remember the exact details, but in Texas, essentially they were saying, like, you can't be excluding oil and gas. This is a core part of our business. Like, they were criticizing BlackRock essentially for its exclusion of oil, to the extent that it was excluding oil and gas for environmental reasons, to which the CEO of BlackRock said, no, we believe in the long-term value of oil and gas, and we will of course not penalize or, keep investments away from the oil and gas industry in Texas. So now that's very much related to the political environment there right now, but people are asking more and more, where do you stand? Where do companies stand? And as we see companies being forced to make a claim about where they stand. Now, I see this in other places. This is going on with what's happening in Disney and the pressure their CEO got from the employees of Disney to actually take a stand on the bill that's going on in Florida. This is happening elsewhere, but more and more employees and consumers are asking the company, where do you stand on the ideological spectrum? What do you believe? And they want all of their actions to be in alignment with that. So in the case of their investments, they want their investments to be aligned with it. But in the case of investment operators, the question is, you can't sort of say, I'm on the sideline. You're going to have to start saying, how am I investing in a way that is in alignment with what I believe? And in our case, we believe that climate change is real and is an immediate threat to our survival as a species. And so it is critical that we are investing in a way that reduces the likelihood of harm to the best of our ability.
So generally speaking, kind of more segmented, do you feel that investment firms are going to likely, because this is something I've heard recently on the All In podcast, not sure if you listened to that one with Chamath and Jason Kalkanis, but they're talking about this idea of kind of everybody does have different social kind of like alignments, right? There's certain things that might be broadly the same, but there's going to be nuances within it. How are investment advisors, do you think, kind of going to be falling in that? Don't they have a responsibility to have the options for whoever they're investing for and to do it correctly on their behalf? Or are they allowed to, I'm not sure how the laws work here, are they allowed to say, no, we don't want to work with that, we refuse to kind of invest in these types of items?
So investment advisors have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients. And what that means is that we cannot make a recommendation that goes in line against their best interests. Now, on a strict sense, the fiduciary is referring just to money. The sort of strictest interpretation of that. So I cannot make a recommendation that is a bad financial, would be against my client's interests. But however, their interests can be broader than just financial returns, is one way of looking at that. But the other way of looking at that is within what they care about, it is my responsibility to do my best to make sure that I'm acting in their interests and not my own. And I think that, so it is not a violation to say, these are the constraints that we are operating in, and we are going to take our fiduciary responsibility within those constraints, as long as we're being honest about and clear what those constraints are. And I think that in the case of 401ks, it's a little different. There are more rules around that. But even like in our plan, we do have to offer, not just our own portfolio. We have to give people other choices that are also good options. But we are definitely allowed to say, and we do say, that it is even in the case where it is not the best thing to do financially on a global maximum, it is the best thing to do if what you care about is climate change. And in our case, even more so, because we don't see a financial cost to it. People aren't sacrificing that. So
yeah,
that was a little long-winded.
No, that makes sense. I think it's that's kind of what it comes down to ultimately, right? Is that maybe perhaps like given your knowledge of the markets and everything, like there's actually, you could argue even that, hey, listen, these traditional kind of assets or whatever you want to say, conventional assets are, headed for a bad course, right? Because there might be regulations or whatnot, or just kind of side effects, right? Especially as relates to the climate. But no, I think that's helpful to understand. So just generally, it's kind of interesting to see how you're thinking about the segmenting in the future. One thing I really would like to talk about is kind of your, I guess, thought process or understanding, maybe just thoughts in general on financial literacy and how, like, what do we see? I know I've heard a lot of things recently. I'm not super deep into the space, but I've heard a lot of things kind of in passing from others about how financial literacy is very bad especially in the United States. I'm not sure other places. Could you talk about that a little bit and maybe like some of the ideas on how to fix that? If the finance industry as a whole can play a role in that, just kind of wherever you want to take this.
I'm a little bit of maybe a pessimist in this front. And that comes from a belief that I have that the financial industry is not aligned with general financial literacy. So what that means in particular is that the financial industry gets money from overdraft fees, from trade transaction fees, from when the meme stock issue was going on, Robinhood was making money off of the volume of trades and the information of those trades. Like, that is how they make money. So the more volatility, the better for the financial industry, because all of those transactions, whether they're credit card transactions when people are buying stuff, or whether they're trade transactions when people buying shares of a company, that's where they're making money. So the idea that financial institutions are going to help try to promote more responsibility on that front, less engagement with less engagement with the sort of casino of the financial industry, to me is not particularly plausible. They have too much to lose and they have too much to gain from keeping things the way they are, or even exacerbating them. And these might not be through malicious machinations on a large scale, but just through small individual decisions about how you build a user interface or how you price something. All of those decisions in aggregate aligns the financial institution away from increasing financial literacy. So I'm fairly pessimistic on that front. However, I think that we have seen a rise in individuals coming forth and helping folks understand what's going on in a more approachable fashion. We've seen the rise of financial TikTok, of people doing microblogs on their finances, about people engaging in forums like the FIRE movement, Financial Independence Retire Early, has a very active online discussion groups, and they care a lot about financial literacy, not just on the like, how do you invest, but how do you spend responsibly? How do you relate to money? Which is, I think, a very important question that's probably at the heart of a lot of financial literacy in the terms of understanding the jargon of the industry is one part of the literacy. Is like, what is your expense ratio on a fund? You should know what that means if you're buying a fund. You should know that has to do with how much it costs and that there will be this cost embedded in owning it. That's like the sort of technically what you need to know. But also there's a larger question, which is, am I just trying to accumulate money? What am I going to use it for? Why am I spending the money I'm spending? Those questions on terms of how we relate to has both a really big implication on your financial pocketbook. Like, if you spend less money, you have more to spend on the things you care about. So knowing what you care about is really important. So you're only spending money on those things. But also from an environmental perspective, spending more money means you're buying more things. And if you're buying more, not always, but often, that means you have a higher carbon intensity. And that means that you're going to spend more of your life working for that money, which will have a high carbon intensity. And those things together have an environmental impact. So I think both important in terms of understanding the technicalities, absolutely. Demystify the financial industry so the financial industry cannot take advantage of you. Really important. That means you have to learn some jargon, means you have to learn some technical bits, but it's a good thing to do. And then second is understanding your relationship with money, because that is going to be how you can cut through a lot of the noise and say, is this important to me? And that will allow you to invest more wisely, and that will allow you to save more wisely. So I think those are both really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also interesting, kind of going back to what you mentioned early on the resiliency front, with energy independence, for example, right? I would venture to assume that if a society or a citizenship as a whole has a more stable kind of finance situation, which I think there's a lot of speculation or reports on how close many US households, for example, are to like bankruptcy, right? Just 30 days away from having everything taken, right? Imagine if there's a lot more responsibility taught on there, and then everybody has kind of cushions, right? It creates this little bit of a spring, right, to absorb and handle recessions more easily, right? I think it's just this idea. This is, again, this might be beyond the scope of this podcast, but just this idea of responsibility. And sometimes I feel often that a lot of people just kind of neglect to take on that responsibility, to learn and to be responsible with your assets, with the things that you have in the world. But did you have any thoughts that you wanted to offer on that?
Yeah, that fits well into a narrative that the US has had a long time on, who's how we should think about any of the issues we're in. But I'd be hesitant to lean too heavily on the idea of responsibility. While I do personally adhere to a sense that I should, to the best of my ability, be as responsible as I can be, I think it's really easy to put the blame on individuals for why they're in the situation they're in. And this is tied to a bunch of compounding systems. This is everything from education, like whose responsibility is it to teach someone how to be responsible with your money? Are you supposed to just know? Because it's pretty damn confusing. If you try to go into a financial, like pick a financial advisor, that's confusing. Understand what they're saying, that's confusing. I didn't learn that in school. It was hard to learn. And it's like, if you have parents who can teach you, amazing. And if you don't, then you're kind of screwed. And similarly, if like there's a lot of ways to have safety nets and resilience. You can have it through tight-knit communities. When you are getting close to that 90 days, if you have friends who can come in and help out in a way, that makes a big difference in your ability to survive and stay in your situation. So I think in terms of diversifying how you think about financial stability, you can think of it outside of just cash and invest in sort of traditional investments. I think that's really valuable. So I think like there's responsibility all along the chain of parties. I think it's the responsibility of investment advisors, of banks, to teach their members how to be more responsible with their money, which I think is why like traditional banking is so scary to me, as opposed to like co-ops where they're like, no, you're part of our group. We want you to be successful. If we're all taking more responsibility for each other and each other's financial literacy, if we talk about how much we make, if we talk about how we invest our money more openly, if it's not a big secret, we can also be helping those members in our community who might not have that information. So there's another layer of responsibility there. So I think it's a slightly more complicated than just saying we each have to take it on ourselves to make sure that we have the cushion so that us as a country will be more resilient against economic downturns, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things you've mentioned there. One thing that comes to mind when you're talking about this is, I think, obviously if you try to take, and I'm no historian, I like history, but I'm not good with dates. But if you look at kind of the history of, for example, the company, right? I read this book called The Company a while back, and it talked about how, and I just never thought about this, right? That just basically kingdoms and emperors owned everything, right? And then eventually we were able to like have maybe wealthy individuals had, they could create this company and they started doing these trading, right? And we've slowly gone kind of to this future where we're getting closer and closer to things being more individually kind of run, or the responsibility can come down to the individual to have some type of ownership and say on what happens. And I think I would guess that the system that we have that kind of has maybe put a crutch there and has not really helped to educate people per se so super well. I know the school system, there's a lot of interesting books about the origin of the kind of mass school system like this, but the idea I don't think was that the individual was capable of handling their own things, right? They were supposed to be kind of corralled like cattle to some extent, right, to do things. And I think we need to continue to go past those models, right? And then get people into a point where they do know how to be responsible and they have that empowerment. But I also think that, this could get really political really quickly, but it could lead to the people who are in charge being a bit afraid, because when people become really well educated, things come to light, issues come to light much more easily. But I guess maybe, unless you had any thoughts on that, I would be keen to hear your thoughts, generally speaking, on kind of education and getting into finance. I know we talked about this a little bit before the show, kind of it seems really scary. Could you talk about that, unless of course you have any thoughts on the other things I mentioned?
Oh man, so many thoughts, but I'm happy to take in this education direction. And maybe I'll use a not to tie it back to what we were talking about before, maybe less obvious example. I was talking about a lot of how I learned things in the financial space wasn't in the classroom per se. And when we talk about education, we immediately think of, oh, you learn things in the classroom, not anywhere else in your life. One of the things I thought was really fascinating about co-ops is that it teaches a democratic participation in a context that we don't think about democratic participation. We think about democratic participation in voting in the ballot box and following national elections. But it is really it is a process by which we come to collective decisions. And if most of our time is spent working, most of our wake hours are spent working, and most of that time is in a hierarchical system where we're just told what to do, and we never think about what is our responsibility to this group or how do we engage with this group to make it more successful, then we're not going to be particularly good at doing the same thing when it comes to political spheres. So co-ops, which do this, particularly employee-based co-ops, which do that sort of innately, it's required that you are participating to a larger degree and you have more of a say, you have more of that. You're exercising that muscle. And in exercising that muscle, you're learning more about what you care about, how you relate to other people, what is effective, what is ineffective ways of communicating. And all of those help you be a more engaged citizen on the sort of the governmental side. So these systems that we exist in can help teach us to be better, or they can help us teach us to give our and help us, and when I say better, I mean more autonomous. And I think that's a lot of what you were talking about when you're talking about responsibility, is having that autonomy and being able to express what your will is, having that freedom. So if we can think about the governmental, the political, the company, the financial systems that we participate in, and which ones are helping teach us to be more autonomous and engaged and which ones aren't, and for folks who see that happening, can we promote the ones that are and the ones that aren't? Going back to this bank example, is your bank teaching you to be more responsible with your money? Is your credit card teaching you to be more responsible with your money? Can we have the systems that we use in our life be the teachers we need? Because I don't see a direct way in which we have a deep financial literacy course in elementary school. Maybe we could get there, and maybe that's possible, but I would like to imagine to some degree how this happens from where we are. And I think that if folks are inspired by that idea, they could look at their own companies, and if there are ways that their companies can be helping employees and or their customers be more literate. And to bring that just around to a bit of an example on that front is how does how do you set up your company's like retirement saving? Is it set up in a way that helps folks ease into saving more, which could be a great way to help, or do they talk about how you do financial planning for the long run? It reduces stress for employees, so it's a benefit for companies. And it helps folks engage in that side more. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts. I know that wasn't exactly what you had necessarily.
Yeah, no. No, I think it's interesting. I think for me, I'm somebody who didn't go to university and had I'd say I had I had a mentor who taught me a lot about finance. So I have like a better understanding than probably a lot of people, but there's still so many things that, during my day job doing recruitment, and there's times where I talk to finance people and I'm just like, I just don't get it. Right. And I'm always like, kind of, because there's so much, so many terms and jargon thrown around, it's like it's really hard to understand, right? But the same thing was true for me when I started doing recruitment and engineering. I knew nothing, but now I know what they mean, right? So I think that it'll be interesting to me to see if we can try to break down some of those barriers, because a lot of people view finance as like, hey, this is the way to go get rich. But I think that we need to look at it, kind of look at things more collectively and our responsibility to the people around us. And it has to be, this is a difficulty, like this is a cultural thing, right? The West is very individualistic compared to a lot of the Eastern cultures that are like focused on as a collective, how do we do things together? But I think there can be a very healthy balance in there at some point that can really try to guide towards the truth. And one thing you mentioned that really is interesting to me that has come up in a lot of ESG related conversations I've had is this idea of companies helping their people, or their customers, employees or customers, become more literate. I'm really interested to see especially if people are trying to really take seriously the S part of ESG, take that seriously, that they would go about doing things to invest in their employees, right? Because being in talent retention and attraction, the companies oftentimes so easily look past, attracting somebody as like, yeah, we need to pay them well and we need to give them like, decent benefits. But there's so many other nuanced things that go into it, and things like having a good mentorship within companies, all these items, they can really play into that. And again, that's not the topic of today's show, but I just feel like the future, especially with education, is why I'm super passionate about education. Education hasn't really changed all that much for a very long time. And I feel like it's maybe due for a bit of innovation and to some extent. But maybe one last thing, I think it'd be remiss if we didn't bring it up. Could you talk a little bit about the role of blockchain and crypto in the future of finance, generally speaking?
So I both love and hate blockchain. Let me talk about the part I love first. Blockchain enables a decentralized contract in the most abstract sense. So it allows us to do things that weren't possible before and have accountability in a way that wasn't possible before. So a lot of blocking out of people from things like engagement in real estate, a lot of the expenses associated with that is to deal with the problem of like verification of ownership and the amount of capital that you have involved, et cetera, et cetera. So like, because you can't break it down into smaller chunks, you can't verify those chunks over long periods of time, it all becomes more expensive. So there is a world in which a whole bunch of business becomes more streamlined and more accessible to more different people, in a world where we go away from talking about like Bitcoin in particular, which is what people often think when they think cryptocurrencies. And when you hear blockchain, you think cryptocurrency. So you're quickly there in that space. But if you think about blockchain in terms of what it fundamentally does, it opens up some really interesting possibilities that I'm very excited about. What I'm less excited about is the fact that people talk about Bitcoin as a currency, and it isn't used as a currency. It's very rarely used as a currency. It's not stable enough. It's too much of an investment. And it hasn't really lived up to its promise of being able to replace a currency or gold or anything else, really, except another form of investment. And that's why it's gone up so much in value, but that's why people are really excited about it. So really the things they're excited about it weren't what it was intended to be used for. It's the amount of other hype around it. So it's hype for hype's sake. And people have made fortunes based off hype for hype's sake before and will again. And this is another example of it. Yeah. And the way that Bitcoin is structured is there's a real environmental cost to it. It is like we have a finite amount of energy on the planet right now, and a lot of it has a high carbon load to it. And we are collectively using our energy not on solving science, which could be a collective thing we thought was really important, or helping people out of poverty, or dealing with new diseases, or any number of other things we could collectively be using energy for, or building things, tangible things, new spaces. We are using it for a fairly abstract investment type. And while I don't want to judge how people use energy in terms of like what brings value to their lives, it seems like a fairly stark and sad world that represents, that is what we've put so much into. And I would rather have a more exciting world to look forward to. So that's kind of my initial reaction to blockchain, to cryptocurrency, blockchain and crypto. Push back on that. I see your reaction. Like,
I think there's the only reason I've also thought a lot about this, the environmental impacts of blockchain. Like I'm a big believer in what the blockchain can do. Like I wouldn't consider myself an evangelist by any means. It's like, oh, everything has to go this way. But I do think that when you talk about the energy side of things, it depends. There's a lot of instances where mining could actually be the solution to the grid problems because of the intermittency with energy. But this goes into other conversations I've had. Whereas if we overpower the grid with too much energy because of the intermittency, which, we don't have a whole lot of storage yet, Bitcoin mining, for example, could operate as the load kind of differentiator, right? Where it's like, okay, we have too much now, we need to turn it on to make the grid. But again, that's kind of beyond the topic. I think I think
Well,
generally
no,
speaking,
let's do it. Let's go there, because my question still remains, which is why crypto? Why is that the thing that we're going to be working on with all of that extra? So like from the first perspective, you have to install that server farm. So there's a huge amount of embedded capital and resource intensity in that server farm. And then the question is, what are you doing with that downtime? Because if it was just a crypto mining operation, you're losing a lot of money if you're only doing it during peak energy times.
yeah.
So then there's a lot of costs. Now, how are you going to pay back that loan you're going to do on all the initial infrastructure? You're going to have to, like, it's going to have to be enough of a difference that it beats out the crypto miner next door who doesn't care about helping the grid and is just focused on mining cryptocurrencies. So like, I understand how we can intellectually get there, but when we look at the practicalities of the implementation, I haven't seen it happen yet. And that's what makes me skeptical.
I think you're right, though. That's the biggest dilemma that I've come across with everybody on the show is that, especially when it comes to grid issues, the like complete coordination across the grid is what is required to make all of this work. And I don't necessarily see it happening, especially because we both know, right? A lot of the people, like cowboys or whatever you want to call them, in Bitcoin mining, for example, they're not necessarily thinking about the collective. They're just trying to fill their pockets. But I do wonder often about the overall benefit to humanity from blockchain technology specifically, not necessarily, obviously the Bitcoin aspect. I am a believer that, Bitcoin will be around for a long time, but I think that underlying in that core of the technology itself and finding ways, because there's a lot of people I've asked this to, and they've said, hey, listen, there's a lot of methodologies out there that are not nearly as energy intensive as the mining, right?
Sure.
The blockchain aspects don't necessarily have to be super energy intensive.
Ethereum just released that large update, which shifted it to a proof of stake, and proof of stake decreases the energy massively.
Yeah. So but I think it's an interesting problem. But I did want to bring it up since we're in the finance discussion here. I think, are there any other thoughts you wanted to add, or just kind of things to wrap it up? I think we've covered a lot of things. Obviously, we could keep going, but we're kind of around our time here.
I think something we kept flirting around was this idea that the financial industry as a whole has a lot to gain from being obscure, and to sort of, you're fighting against that to gain literacy. But I guess I want to encourage people sort of through our own story about how we gained our financial literacy and built this firm, and just through calling out that's what the industry is doing, is saying, if you're ever intimidated or scared off by what you're finding out in the financial industry and you think that it's not for you, know that they have an invested interest in making you feel that way. And it won't take that much digging, either with your friends, someone in your circle who knows, your family, the internet, YouTubers, like whoever it is, you can probably find the answer. And it's probably not as complicated as it's first made out to be. So in the sort of, and going back to your idea of responsibility, like, this is the encouragement side of that. Not just that it's your responsibility, but maybe the hill isn't as steep as it's being made out to be.
Yeah, I like that. I definitely hope that's the case. I'm gonna go do a bit of research too, and maybe some of the topics that I'm afraid of, I'll go to see how actually scary they are or not. But anyways, I really appreciate this, James. This has been great. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and we will have to probably have you on again in the future as things continue to change.
So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to today. Please let us know what you thought of the show. You can reach out to us directly with your questions on Slack, over LinkedIn as well. We do, of course, have the LinkedIn page. You can interact with us there and with other people commenting and kind of in the climate tech space. And please, of course, share this with somebody who might find it interesting, as our entire goal with this podcast is to spread awareness of the various solutions in the market. A lot of people are just simply not aware because there's so many interesting technologies. Even people who are deep into the space sometimes are so focused on what they're doing that it's sometimes hard to know what other solutions they might partner with to really make a more holistic approach to making the future more green and a better place. You can also I would recommend reaching out to James over at LinkedIn and checking out Carbon Collective's website. And if you are joining us for the first time, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We also really appreciate if you can leave us a review and a rating, as it helps to expand our reach among listeners. And if you are interested in becoming a sponsor or perhaps want to collaborate in any way, you can reach out to me. My email can be found in the description. And if you want to get more involved, please join the Slack channel as mentioned and follow our LinkedIn page. And then just a quick note on our next episode, we will be talking with Damien Klenk, the co-founder of 6C Index, which is a blockchain-enabled carbon index fund. We talk about a lot of things in this one, and it is a little bit more technical, so there's even times where it's a bit hard for me to understand it generally, but I think it's a pretty interesting technology what they're doing and very, very fascinating in general. So definitely looking forward to that conversation up next. And thank you again so much for listening to Clean Techies, the podcast. We will see you next time.